Rain makes every stone in the courtyard shine like a blade. Newark is quiet. In that way, a fortress becomes quiet when it knows what's coming. Torches burn low and stubborn, hissing each time a gust throws water into the flame. The ground is not ground anymore, just a skin of mud stretched tight over cold earth, ready to swallow boots, hooves, pride, and names. They stand in a line before me, boys who have not yet learned how quickly a cheer can turn into a scream. Some wear mail that still looks new, some wear wool that is too thin. All of them wear the same thing beneath it, the hope that tomorrow will make them larger than they are tonight. I don't put myself above them. I stand level. A lord may need a platform. A soldier doesn't. Soldiers need distance, angles, and truth. In my hand is a pair of spurs, not gold, not jeweled, just iron. Honest, practical iron. The kind that doesn't care who you are. The kind that bites a horse if you ask it to. The kind that bites a man's conscience if he forgets what power does. Edric steps forward. He's not the tallest, not the loudest, not the one the hall would bet on if this were a story meant to flatter the ear. He's a squire. Hard hands, tired shoulders, a face that has learned to keep its expression quiet. He has spent more hours with straps and buckles than with applause. I kneel in the mud, because rituals mean nothing if you refuse the dirt that comes with them. My mail shifts and settles with the sound of a chain being laid down. The boy's boot is wet. The leather strap is worn. My fingers work the buckle as if I'm fastening a door against the wind. You can tell a great deal about a man by how he lets you touch the things that matter to him. A horse, a weapon, a promise. Edric stands still. He doesn't fidget. He doesn't perform bravery. He lets the moment be heavy, because it is heavy. Tomorrow he will ride. Tomorrow men will push and pull at the edges of our line and try to tear it open. Tomorrow someone will shout his name, either to call him forward or to call for him after he's fallen. He swallows once and speaks, very quietly, as if his fear might hear him and grow louder. "What if I die, my lord?" I look up at him. The torches make his eyes bright for a heartbeat, then the rain steals the light again. "If you die," I tell him, "die like a nail driven in the right place. A nail doesn't sing. A nail holds." He nods, and I can see him trying to understand what a boy can't fully understand until the world forces it into him. That most of our lives are not made of grand gestures. They are made of holding the line, holding your nerve, holding your mouth shut when a single careless word can start a war. The wind lifts the banners above us. Cloth snaps like a whip. The young knights flinch, just slightly, and then correct themselves. They don't want anyone to see the flinch. That's how I know they're still young. People think the making of a knight happens in the moment a sword touches a shoulder. They imagine music, bright cloth, a clean hall, a clean conscience. I have never trusted clean consciences. They usually haven't been tested. I trust mud. I trust weather. I trust a work that leaves calluses, because those are the things that don't lie. If you want to know how I choose men, don't watch them when they're being praised. Watch them when they're cold, hungry, tired, and unseen. Watch how they handle a horse that doesn't belong to them. Watch whether they tighten the buckle twice or only once. Watch whether they mock the servant who spills a bowl or bend down and pick up the shards without looking for approval. In a world like ours, where steel decides arguments faster than law, the smallest habits become the largest fates. Somewhere beyond the castle wall, in the town below, a hammer begins to strike an anvil. You can't always hear it over the rain, but you can feel it, a dull, steady thump that seems to travel up through the stone and into the soles of your feet. That sound is older than kings, older than banners, older than the songs men will write about tomorrow. It is the sound of making. I turn my head toward it, and for a moment the night plays tricks. In the glow of the forge beyond the wall, the smith's shadow stretches too tall. The smoke thickens, then folds into the shape of a giant at the anvil, faceless, made of ember and cold dark fog. He raises his hammer with the slow confidence of something that can't be rushed. And when it falls, it feels like the world itself has blinked. Then the vision is gone. Just rain, just torches, just men breathing into the cold. I don't speak of what I saw. A commander doesn't hand his doubts to boys like gifts, but I keep the meaning of it close, because whether that giant exists or not, the truth does. Men are forged, not once, not in ceremony, over and over in small corrections, in bitter mornings, in the humiliation of being told to do it again. The line of young knights shifts, and I walk along them, not like a king inspecting trophies, like a craftsman inspecting tools. One boy's shield strap is twisted. He hasn't noticed. He's more concerned with the way he looks than with the way his gear sits. I stop beside him and fix it with 2 fingers. He looks at me, embarrassed, and I can see the temptation in him. Temptation to explain, to make a joke, to blame the rain. I give him nothing to push against, just a corrected strap and my silence. Silence is a kind of blade. It cuts away excuses. Further down the line, another boy stands too tall, chest out, chin high. Pride is easy to spot. It shines. But pride is not strength. Pride is a crack you can't see until pressure arrives. I step close enough that he can smell wet iron and smoke on me. Lower your chin, I say. He does it. He hates it, I can tell. Again. He does it again. This time it's correct. Not because he understands yet, but because he obeyed. Understanding comes later, if it comes at all. A gust drives rain sideways. One torch sputters and almost dies. A guard shields it with his hand and breathes life back into the flame. That's the work. That's always the work. Not the glory, not the cheering, keeping the flame alive when the weather wants it out. Edric stands with his new spurs, shoulders squared, watching me the way a man watches a door that might open or might not. He thinks tomorrow is the gate he has to pass through. He doesn't understand that tonight is the gate. Tonight, when nobody's watching, when no crowd is waiting to be impressed. I turn to the line again. You want to know how I choose a young knight? I say, letting my voice carry just enough to settle them without stirring them. I choose by small things, because small things don't lie. I let that sit. Let the rain answer for me. Tomorrow the world will be loud. Tomorrow a man can pretend, he can shout, he can charge, he can make himself look brave for a few seconds before fear finds him. But tonight is honest. Tonight, in Newark, with mud at our feet and fog in our throats, I fasten iron to a boy's boot and pretend it's only a spur. It isn't. It is a promise that power will be controlled, a warning that speed without discipline kills, a reminder that the horse is not the only thing that must be guided. And as the hammer in the town below keeps striking, steady, patient, indifferent, I understand what I have understood all my life. A kingdom doesn't stand because men dream of glory. It stands because someone, somewhere, does the hard, unglamorous work of making men reliable. That is the forge. That is my war. And tomorrow, in the fog outside Lincoln, we will learn whether the iron we've shaped can hold. I was a hostage before I was a knight. People like to begin my story with tournaments, with bright banners and the clean sound of a trumpet. They like to begin with a man who already knows who he is. But that isn't where a man is made. A man is made where he has no armor, no choice, and no voice that anyone is required to hear. I remember a cold gray day at Newbury. The sky hung low, heavy as wet wool. The stone of the castle sweated with damp, and outside the walls, the enemy camp spread across the fields like a stain. Tents, smoke, men with spears, horses shifting in the mud. It wasn't a heroic sight. It was the ordinary shape of power in my world. Steel on one side, fear on the other, and hunger in both. I was small enough that a soldier's hand around my arm felt like a shackle. Small enough that the meaning of what was happening was too large to fit in my head. But children understand more than adults want to admit. I understood this much. I was being carried out as a message. They led me toward the gate as if they were leading a lamb to show a knife. The wind smelled of smoke and wet leather. Men watched me the way men watch a tool being tested. A child can feel that kind of attention like a weight on the skin. Above, on the battlements, my father stood, John Marshal, stone-faced, cloak pulled tight against the wind. He looked down and did not soften. People have told and retold that moment, polishing it until it sounds like legend, like he was carved from granite and incapable of fear. I don't know what words he spoke, not exactly. I only know what I saw. A man who refused to bend, even when bending might have saved his son's tears. That is a brutal thing to learn as a child, that love does not always look like rescue. Down below, the men who held me wanted a bargain. They wanted the castle, or obedience, or a surrender that would save them time and blood, and they used me to press the point. A rope appeared in someone's hands, not raised in a dramatic gesture, just present, just practical, the way the world can be cruel without theatrics. I remember staring at that rope and thinking, in the honest way children think, that it had no business being part of my life, that it belonged to wells and carts and ship rigging, anything except a child's day. But war doesn't care what belongs where. For a moment, it felt as if the air itself changed. The smoke from their fires curled and shifted along the wall. It made a shape that my mind gave a name, a dragon. Not a golden beast from stories, a thin, hungry thing made of cold breath and darker smoke, stretched along the wall like a shadow with teeth. It didn't roar, it didn't fly, it just existed, patient and inevitable. Later, I would understand that dragon is simply what fear looks like when you are too young to call it its true name. I don't claim miracles. I don't pretend heaven reached down and pulled me away. The truth is harsher and simpler. Men in power calculate. Even in cruelty, they calculate. Killing a child in full view can ignite a fire that burns hotter than any castle gate. Sometimes restraint is not mercy, it is strategy. The siege shifted. The moment passed. The rope lowered. I was taken back inside. And then, when the shouting fell behind the stone and the world became quieter, I did what children do when they have nowhere to put terror. I ran. I ran across the inner yard with my breath tearing at my throat. The ground was slick with rain. My feet were too quick for the mud. I tripped and went down hard. My palms hit the earth. My knees burned. For a few heartbeats, I was nothing but pain and humiliation, and the taste of wet dirt. I cried, once, sharply, like a cough. Then I bit my lip, because I had already learned a dangerous lesson. Showing weakness can invite more of the same. I pushed myself up, not gracefully, not bravely, just because the ground was cold and it was better to be standing than kneeling. That was the moment a quiet man noticed me. A monk or a priest, someone in a plain robe, older, with hands that had seen more prayer than violence. He did not rush to comfort me with sweet words. He did not tell me that everything would be fine, because men like him know better than to make promises they can't keep. He simply stepped close, crouched, and held out a small piece of wood. It was nothing special to look at, no carving, no jewel, just smooth from handling. The kind of thing a person carries because it matters to them, not because it impresses anyone else. He placed it in my hand. He said, "Hold this, not to strike, to remember. Your hand was made to hold yourself, not to shake." A child doesn't always understand advice in the moment it is given, but the body understands. My fingers closed around that wood, and for the first time that day, something in me stopped spinning. It was an anchor, a small, solid object that didn't negotiate, didn't threaten, didn't change with the wind. And without meaning to, I learned something that would follow me for the rest of my life. When the world turns into noise, you survive by taking hold of something steady. Breath, posture, duty, a simple task done correctly. Years later, men would come to me with sons of their own, boys like I once was, boys with too much hope and too little experience, wrapped in wool and ambition. Their fathers would talk about lineage, about honor, about what they could offer. Some would flatter, some would bargain. I rarely listened to the speeches, because I learned at Newberry that a man's true shape is not revealed by what he promises when he is safe. It is revealed by how he behaves when he is small, scared, and powerless. When I chose young men for my household, I looked for the ability to stand up after being knocked down, without waiting for permission. I looked for the ability to keep the hand steady when the heart is racing. I looked for a boy who can swallow pride in silence and then do the work again. Because war does not ask whether you are ready, it simply arrives. And when it arrives, the difference between a boy who becomes a knight and a boy who becomes a tragedy is often nothing more than this: can he hold himself together when the world tries to pull him apart? That is what Newbery gave me. Not a victory, not a story fit for a minstrel, a lesson carved into a child's bones. You may be placed on the table like a coin, weighed and traded by men with swords, but you can still choose not to break. And that choice, made early, made quietly, is where the forging begins. I crossed into Normandy with salt on my lips, and not much else to my name. The sea was the first thing I remember, gray, restless, and cold enough to make your bones feel hollow. The little ship creaked as it nosed into the shoreline, and the wind came at us like it meant to push us back into the water. I stepped down onto wet sand with a bundle on my shoulder and the same thought beating in my head: I'm here to learn how to fight. I was wrong. I didn't enter a school. I entered a household. And a household is not a place that teaches with speeches. It teaches with rhythm, with bells, with chores, with the quiet pressure of being watched even when no one seems to be watching. The estate of William de Tankerville rose out of the mist like a lesson in stone and timber. Solid walls, a hall built for order, stables built for work, and people moving as if the day had a spine and every hour knew where it belonged. There were banners, yes, and men with mail and weapons, but what struck me most was not the steel, it was the routine. A steward looked me over like you'd look over a tool you're not sure you can trust yet. No welcoming, no soft questions. A gesture toward the stables. So I went to the stables. If you want to understand how a knight is made, start there. Not with a sword, with a horse's breath in the dark. Inside, the air was warm and sharp with the smell of straw and sweat and leather. Horses stood like living walls, shifting their weight, stamping, blowing steam into the cold. Their eyes watched everything. They didn't care who my father was. They didn't care what I dreamed of becoming. A horse only cares about one thing: whether you're steady. I lifted my hand toward the nearest one and immediately regretted it. The horse snapped its head, the white of its eye flashing. My heart leapt like a trapped thing. I took half a step back, just enough to keep my face, not enough to flee. That's when the master of horse noticed me. He didn't smile. Men like him don't waste smiles on beginners. He stepped close, placed his own hand on the horse's neck with the calm confidence of long practice, and spoke like he was giving a rule of nature. He said, "Don't fight your fear. Make it tired. Breathe. Then work." So I breathed. I opened my palm. I moved slowly. The horse sniffed my fingers and, little by little, stopped challenging me. That was my first real lesson in Normandy. Strength is not the first requirement. Control is. The days that followed were not heroic. They were endless. Before the sun, there was work. Not the kind of work that earns applause. Work that earns you a place. I shoveled filth until my shoulders burned. I carried buckets until my hands went numb. I learned to buckle straps properly, to tie knots that didn't slip, to lift a saddle without making it look like it was lifting me. I learned to check a hoof the way you check your own pulse, because a lame horse can ruin a man, and a ruined man can ruin a mission. If I did it wrong, I did it again. No one shouted. They didn't need to. The punishment was repetition, and repetition is a sharper whip than anger. You can heal from a beating. You can't cheat a habit. By midday, I was in the hall. That was a different kind of stable. Same power, different animal. The great hall smelled of wood smoke, roasted meat, wax, damp wool, and politics. Men spoke softly over cups and trenchers, and every soft word carried weight. I stood behind chairs, poured wine, carried platters, and learned how to disappear without leaving my post. I learned where to place my eyes, low enough to be respectful, high enough to see what mattered. I learned not to stare. I learned not to interrupt. I learned the strange truth that silence can be a form of courage. A steward caught me once, looking up too long as a noble spoke. He didn't strike me, he simply tapped the table with the end of his staff, a small sound that cut through the room like a blade. That was enough. Because the hall teaches you this: a careless gesture, a careless glance, a careless sentence can start a quarrel that turns into blood. After the hall came the yard again, running, lifting, falling, standing back up, wooden swords and shields, crude and heavy, teaching the body what the mind can't yet hold. When you're young, you want the good strike, the one that looks brave. The older men cared about something else: a strike that returns, a guard that stays, a stance that doesn't collapse when your lungs burn. And always, always, the horse waited for you in the morning like a judge that doesn't speak. There were boys in that household who wore better boots than I did, better belts, better confidence. They laughed at my rough clothes and my mud-stained hands, as if any of that mattered when a lance breaks and a man is screaming for his reins. One of them called me a knight in rags. I didn't answer, not because I was meek, because I was learning. I was learning that if you spend your voice on every insult, you'll have none left when you need it to save someone. So I swallowed it. I went back to work. At night, after the hall had gone quiet and the stables had settled into soft shifting and occasional snorts, I would sit by a kitchen fire and repair what my day had worn down: a strap that had started to split, a seam that had torn, a buckle that needed cleaning. Needle through leather, thread pulled tight, fingers stinging. It sounds small. It isn't. A loose strap is not a mistake. It's a death waiting for a moment. The older I got, the more I understood that courage is useless if your gear betrays you. Some nights, when my eyelids were heavy and the room was dark but for the last glow of embers, I would hear it, the distant hammer of a smith somewhere beyond the walls. Not loud, just steady, a rhythm you could feel more than hear, like the heartbeat of the world. And sometimes, half asleep, that hammer became a dream. In the dream, I wasn't a boy in a bunk. I was a piece of iron on an anvil, still crooked, still raw. A faceless smith lifted his hammer and brought it down with patience. Each blow hurt in a way that didn't bleed. Each blow made me straighter, not prettier, not more impressive, just more reliable. Then I'd wake to the same ceiling beams, the same damp air, the same ache in my arms, and I would understand something simple, something that would guide me the rest of my life. A knight doesn't enter through the wide gate of glory. He enters through the narrow door of service. You do not begin by being trusted with a sword. You begin by being trusted with a horse, with a cup of wine in a crowded hall, with a strap that must not fail, with your own mouth, learning when to speak and when to stay silent. That was Normandy for me, not a story of triumph, a story of being useful. And once a man becomes useful, truly useful, then and only then does the world begin to consider whether he might also become great. The day I was made a knight, there was no music, no bright hall, no polished ceremony that let a man pretend the world was tidy. There was only a campaign camp in Normandy, wet ground, low tent, smoke from damp fires, and men who had slept in their armor because they didn't know if they would have time to put it on later. The air smelled of mud, horse sweat, and iron, the kind of smell that tells you the truth before anyone speaks. I knelt anyway. Not because the ground was holy, because the moment was. And because in a world where a man can be cut down for a careless step, you learn that some things deserve your full attention. A senior knight stood over me. His sword was plain, not a treasure, not a relic. It had scratches the way a working tool has scratches. The blade carried rainwater and smoke, and when it touched my shoulder, it was so light, so controlled, that it was almost gentle. Almost. Then the weight arrived, not on my shoulder, but inside my chest. People think knighthood is a prize, a reward, a crown on the head of a young man's ambition. But in that moment, all I could think was this: from now on, my mistakes won't just hurt me, they can kill someone else. When I stood up, I didn't feel larger, I felt watched by the world. After the ceremony, life didn't pause to admire me. The camp moved, men shouted orders, horses were led and saddled, gear was checked and checked again. A new knight doesn't get a quiet day to enjoy his title, he gets work. That knight, an older veteran, one of those men who look as if they were forged, not born, handed me a heavy wooden practice sword. It wasn't elegant, it was a block of wood with an edge, designed to teach the body without cutting the flesh. I took it, and immediately understood why he had chosen something so crude. The weight was honest. The weight punished careless movement. He watched my stance and didn't waste time with praise. Don't swing like you're chopping wood. Swing like you're opening a door. The strike must have a way out. You'll live on the way out more than the way in. He moved closer and adjusted my shoulders, then my hips. He placed my shield where he wanted it and tapped the edge with 2 fingers. Cover your chin, he said. Men die because they lose their face first. It sounds like a joke until you've seen a man drop because he took a blow where he thought the shield didn't need to be. It sounds like superstition until you've watched panic make a proud young knight lift his head, show his throat, and give the enemy exactly what they want. So I learned the position, again and again, until my arms shook and my wrists burned and my shoulders felt as if they belonged to someone older. In the days that followed, the lessons sharpened. A knight learns quickly that fighting is not a dance. It is not a chain of beautiful strikes. It is confusion, noise, and 100 small decisions made under pressure. If you survive, it is rarely because you did something glorious. It is because you did something correct. Footwork in mud, not slipping, not overreaching, keeping the weight centered so you can move again, not just strike once. Shield angle, not too low, not too high, just enough to hide what must not be shown. And always the same rule, every motion has a return. The veteran would stop me mid-swing and push my blade back into guard. Again, he'd say. And if my pride tried to argue, the wooden sword would answer for him, heavy, unforgiving, dragging my arms down until I stopped thinking about being impressive and started thinking about being effective. At dusk, when the camp quieted, I would sit with my gear and clean it, not because I loved the ritual, but because I feared what negligence could do. Mud in a buckle, a strap beginning to split, a scabbard mouth worn just enough to snag when you draw. These are not inconveniences, they are traps you lay for yourself. Sometimes the veteran would sit near me, not speaking much. Men like that don't teach with speeches, they teach by letting you watch them do everything carefully, even when no one is watching. Once, as I wiped rain and soot from my sword, he asked me a question that surprised me. What do you think knighthood is? I was young enough to answer with the first lie every young man believes. Winning, I said. He shook his head, just once, like closing a door. No, he said. Knighthood is keeping yourself when you win. That sentence stayed with me longer than any bruise, because it was true. A sword gives you power, and power is a heat you can't see until it burns something you meant to protect. Later, when we marched again, when the road turned to mud and the horizon looked like trouble, I found myself staring at my hands, those same hands that once shoveled manure and repaired straps by a kitchen fire, hands that now could take a life with a flick. And for a moment, my mind played its own hard lesson. I imagined holding an iron nail fresh from a forge, red hot, painful, impossible to keep in the palm unless you were willing to endure. That is what authority feels like when you understand it. Hot, heavy, dangerous. Not because it is evil, but because it changes things the moment you touch it. A new knight wants to feel invincible. I didn't. Not after Newbury, not after Normandy, not after learning that even a horse can sense your fear before you admit it. I wanted one thing, to be reliable. To strike and return, to hold my shield where it belonged, to keep my chin down, to know when to press forward and when to stop, to do the work that keeps the man beside me alive. Because the real truth of knighthood isn't the title, it is the responsibility. And the responsibility begins not with the first blow you land, but with the first time you choose restraint when you have the right and the power to do otherwise. That is how I began, in a wet camp with no music, not crowned by glory, marked by discipline. The first time I rode into a tournament, I understood why men fall in love with the noise. Banners snapped in the wind like bright wounds against the sky. Pavilions lined the edge of the field, their canvas taut, their ropes humming with tension. Merchants shouted, squires ran with spare lances. The crowd pressed close to the wooden stands, as if their eyes alone could decide who would win. There was laughter, music somewhere in the distance, and the dangerous sweetness of being watched. A young man can mistake that for destiny. I did, at first. I sat high in the saddle with mail on my shoulders, a shield on my arm, and a lance upright like a promise. My horse breathed warm and fast beneath me. The leather creaked, the bit clicked, and the earth under the hooves felt too soft, too ready to give way. The signal came. Horn, flag, a sharp gesture from officials who pretended this was sport rather than controlled violence. Horses began to move. Then they began to run. When a horse war accelerates, you don't simply ride. You become part of its motion. The saddle pulls at your hips, your knees clamp the leather, your hands fight the temptation to jerk the reins. You feel the ground through the animal's legs, you feel the weight of your armor drag against your shoulders, and you feel, very clearly, the truth no song ever admits. If you get it wrong, you don't lose face, you lose teeth, you lose breath, you lose a future. The first collision wasn't the clean joust, it was a crush. Men and horses and shields slamming together, lances snapping, dust erupting like smoke. The world became fragments, a helmet edge, a shield rim, a horse's flank, the sudden sting of impact running through my forearm. Then I was gone from the saddle. The fall happens faster than pride. One moment you are above the chaos, the next the earth rises to meet you. Armor doesn't protect you from weight, it adds to it, it drags you down, it turns a stumble into a slam. I remember the sound of my helmet striking ground, dull, brutal. Dust filled my mouth, my lungs refused to cooperate for a heartbeat, and around me hooves thundered past with no regard for the man beneath them. That is what a tournament teaches you immediately and without mercy. The fight does not pause because you are surprised. I lay there for a moment, just long enough for fear to offer me an easy choice. Stay down. Let the field swallow you. Let someone else carry the story. Then I stood. Not gracefully, not like the painted knights in books. I stood because the body remembers what the mind debates. I found my footing in the churned earth, spat dust, and looked for a gap, because if you stare at the nearest threat, you miss the opening that saves you. A squire brought me another horse. I mounted again, quick but not reckless, and rode back into the press of men. The romance had burned off. What was left was work, reading movement, finding space, keeping your balance, striking only when it mattered, and never chasing the noise. That day, and in many tournaments after, I learned 3 truths that would shape how I judged young men for the rest of my life. The first truth is about falling. Everyone falls, off horses, out of favor, into trouble. What matters is what happens after. Some men fall and panic. They start making wild decisions, swinging too hard, breathing too fast, losing the line. Those men are dangerous to everyone around them. But there are men who fall and return. Men who treat the ground like a lesson and not a sentence. Those men can be forged. The second truth is about vision. A poor knight looks only at the opponent directly in front of him. A better knight looks at the space between opponents, the seams in the line, the weak angle, the moment where a horse turns its head, where a shield shifts, where a man's attention breaks. Combat is not just strength against strength, it is pattern against pattern. The man who can see the pattern survives longer. The third truth is the hardest because it goes against the hunger in young blood. It is the truth of stopping. A tournament is full of temptations. The temptation to humiliate the man you've beaten. The temptation to strike once more just to prove you can. The temptation to turn victory into cruelty because the crowd is watching and you want them to remember your name. I saw those temptations in others long before I learned to kill them in myself. That evening, inside a pavilion thick with candle smoke and sweat, men drank and shouted about their captures. They talked about ransoms like they were counting coins, and they laughed as if laughter could wash away what they'd done to win. A captive sat at the edge of the tent, tied and bruised. A drunk knight leaned in close to him, mocking him in the way cowards mock once they feel safe. The captive flinched, and the knight laughed harder, enjoying the power of it. I watched for a moment. Then I set my cup down on the table, slowly, deliberately, so that the sound of wood against wood would cut through the noise. The tent fell quiet in stages. A few men turned, then more. They didn't know why they were listening. They just felt that something had shifted. I stood and stepped between the drunk and the captive. I didn't draw my sword. I didn't need to. I let my stillness do the work. "You've won," I told the drunk. "Don't make victory filthy." He sneered. Someone like him always sneers because sneering is easier than thinking. Can honor buy bread? He spat. And that was the question at the heart of so many young men's mistakes. They think honor is decoration, something you wear when it's convenient. I looked at him and answered as simply as I could. Honor doesn't feed you, but without it, you won't have a house where bread can be eaten. That is not poetry, it is mechanics. A household, a lord's service, a king's trust. These things are held together by behavior. If you turn victory into cruelty, you don't just shame yourself. You create enemies that don't forget. You create disorder. And disorder is the enemy of everything you claim to protect. The drunk backed away, not because he suddenly understood, but because he recognized a boundary that couldn't be crossed without consequence. The tent breathed again. The captive lowered his eyes and exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for hours. Later, outside, the field was quiet and the dust had settled into the grass. I saw a coin drop into the dirt near my boot, maybe someone's careless wager lost. It bounced, rolled, and came to rest in the dust like a reminder that fortune is always turning, always indifferent. Men like to blame fortune when they lose. They like to praise fortune when they win. But I had learned something else, over and over. Fortune turns quickly. Discipline turns slowly, and it lasts. That is why tournaments mattered. Not because they were glamorous, because they stripped men down. They showed you who could return after falling, who could see the pattern, who could stop himself from becoming ugly when he had the power to be ugly. And those are the men I trusted later, on battlefields that were not games, where the dust wasn't applause, and where the cost of a moment's vanity could be a kingdom. I first met the young king in a room full of light. That's what people remember about him. The glow, the laughter, the way a hall would lean toward him as if warmth itself had taken human shape. He wore a crown while his father still lived, and that alone made him dangerous because it made him both powerful and hungry. A young fire, already given a name, already surrounded by men who wanted to be warmed by it. I stood behind him often, not as a shadow, but as a wall. At court, everything looks polished from a distance. Silk, bright belts, jeweled rings, the shimmer of mail under fine cloth. But if you stand close enough, you see the truth. Court is a battlefield where the weapons are glances, whispers, and pride. You can lose your life without anyone drawing a sword, just by speaking at the wrong moment, to the wrong person, in the wrong tone. The young king loved splendor. He loved the sound of approval. He loved an entourage the way a torch loves dry kindling. And around him gathered young noblemen who wanted the same thing, to be seen, to be named, to be remembered. They came as if to a festival. They thought they were arriving to learn glory. What they needed was discipline. When I began to shape the young king's household, when I began to decide who belonged near him and who did not, I did not start with speeches about honor. Speeches are cheap. A boy can borrow fine words the way he borrows a fine cloak. He can return them the moment he is tested. So I watched the small things. I watched how they entered a yard, who arrived early and who arrived late with excuses already polished on the tongue. I watched who tightened a strap twice and who tightened it once and trusted luck to do the rest. I watched who drank to warm himself and who drank to forget himself. And I watched their backs. A man's mouth can lie. His back tells the truth. There is a kind of bowed posture that is cowardice, and another kind that is understanding, knowing how to show respect without becoming soft. There is a straight posture that is discipline, and another that is vanity, chest out, chin high, as if the world owes him admiration. The ones who carried their pride like a spear pointed inward were the ones I feared most, not because they were weak, because they were reckless. Some of them thought the stables were beneath them. They were wrong. A horse is the first judge of a knight. It doesn't care who your father is. It cares whether your hand is calm, whether your breath is steady, whether your fear leaks into your fingertips. I watched boys approach a warhorse like it was a statue. Quick hands, loud voices, confident smiles. And I watched the horse step away from them, because animals are wiser than flattery. Then I watched another boy approach slowly, palm open, eyes down, breathing measured. The horse sniffed him and lowered its head. That boy didn't look heroic. That boy looked reliable. Reliability is rarer than courage. I watch them in the hall, too. The hall is where young men learn the cruelty of hierarchy. It is also where they reveal whether they deserve to rise. A servant drops a bowl. It shatters on stone. The sound is small, but the moment is large. One boy laughs. Another steps back as if he might catch the servant's clumsiness by standing too close. And one, quiet, almost invisible, kneels to gather the shards without being asked. That's the difference. That is always the difference. The young king needed men who could win a fight, yes, but even more, he needed men who would not disgrace him when they won. Men who understood that power is not permission to be ugly. I remember one afternoon near the stables, when a young noble kicked over a water tub in frustration. It was nothing, just wood and water. A tantrum turned into a splash. But the horse nearest him jumped. Tack jingled. A handler cursed under his breath as he steadied the animal. The boy said the most dangerous words a young knight can say. It's only a horse. Only. I stepped close enough that he could hear the rain in my cloak and smell the stable on me. A horse remembers, I told him. It remembers your anger. It remembers your hands. And tomorrow, when you need it to carry you through fear, it will answer with what you taught it. He opened his mouth to argue. I cut him off. Only is how men die, I said. Only a loose strap. Only a careless word. Only a moment of temper. Then only a grave. Some of them hated me for that. They wanted a hero who would clap their shoulders and tell them they were destined for greatness. They wanted a commander who would let them burn. I did not come to court to burn. I came to keep the fire from consuming the house. Because that is what a household is. A machine. A living machine. Built out of horses, men, money, and reputation. If a single bolt shakes loose, the whole thing begins to rattle. And when it rattles in public, enemies listen. I began to narrow the circle. Not everyone could stay near the young king. Not everyone deserved to. I chose fewer men than others did. I accepted the complaints. I accepted the resentment. Better a handful of disciplined men than a crowd that would collapse when the wind changed. When I trained them like you train a shield wall. I built the habit first, because habit is what shows up when fear arrives. In the yard, I made them move as one. Step, stop, turn, hold. Not for show, for control. A young man thinks retreat is shame. I taught them the truth. A retreat done in order is not cowardice. A retreat done in panic is death. In the stables, I made them re-tie knots until their fingers remembered. I did not allow good enough, because good enough is how a saddle slips when the ground turns bad. A buckle doesn't care about your pride. It cares about tension. In the hall, I taught them another kind of fighting, listening, keeping their mouths shut, knowing when silence is protection, knowing that sometimes the bravest act is not speaking the clever thing you want to say. And in the chapel, I taught them to begin with stillness, not because prayer makes a blade sharper, but because a man who cannot kneel in quiet will not stand steady under pressure. The young king's court was full of music, full of feasts, full of moments that made boys believe they were invincible. I did not try to take those moments away from him. A fire needs air, but I kept a hand near the water. Because when the world finally demanded payment, and it always demands payment, the men beside him would matter more than the songs. So, when you ask me what it was like to serve the young king, I will tell you this. He was light, he was beauty, he was danger. And my work, my real work, was not to shine beside him. It was to take the brightest, most reckless boys in the hall and forge a few of them into men who could hold their shape when the heat rose. That is how you protect a king. Not with flattery, with discipline, quiet, relentless, and strong enough to survive even when the fire tries to escape its hearth. By the time I had a household of my own, I had learned a hard truth about power. It doesn't forgive sentiment. A lord can be generous. A lord can be kind. But a lord who chooses badly doesn't only hurt himself, he breaks the men who stand near him. In my world, that kind of mistake doesn't end in embarrassment. It ends in bodies. So when families began bringing their sons to my gate, I did not greet them like a merchant welcoming customers. I greeted them like a craftsman looking at raw iron. Because that is what a boy is when he arrives. Not a knight, not a hero, not even a promise, just material. And the question is never, is he noble enough? The question is, can he be forged without shattering? It was a windy morning at Pembroke, the kind of wind that comes off the sea and makes every banner sound like it's arguing with the sky. The stone of the gatehouse was damp. Mist moved low across the yard like a slow tide. Guards stood in mail, spears grounded, watching the road. A small noble family arrived with a boy, Edric, though the name mattered less than the posture. His father carried a letter sealed in wax. No lavish gifts, no silver plate, no theatrical pleading, just a plain dagger in a simple sheath and the kind of nervous hope I had seen 100 times. The father spoke first, too quickly. Men always talk too quickly when they are afraid their child will be refused. "My lord," he said, "we are not rich, but the boy is strong. He wants to learn." I did not answer the father, not at first. I looked at the boy, because fathers sell visions. Boys sell truth without meaning to. "Name?" I asked. "Edric," he said. "Edric of whom?" He hesitated just long enough to show he'd been taught to answer with a family name, then chose honesty over display. "Edric of... It doesn't matter," he said, and swallowed. "I came to learn." That was the first thing he did right. He didn't wear his lineage like armor. I didn't smile. A smile at the gate is a mistake. It tells a boy the test is already over. Instead, I pointed toward the stables. "Come," I said. "Show me your hands." He followed me inside, and the air changed immediately. Warmer, sharper, full of straw and leather and the steady breathing of animals that can kill you by accident if you are careless. A war horse lifted its head as Edric stepped. The horse's eye flashed. Its breath made pale fog in the stable's dim light. Edric froze. Not for long. He didn't retreat. He didn't put on a brave face. He did what I wanted to see. He took a breath, opened his palm, and moved slowly. The horse sniffed his fingers. Then it lowered its head. A man can lie. A horse can't. That was enough to keep the test going. I tossed Edric an old strap, leather cracked, damp, with a buckle that's seen too many winters. It wasn't a gift. It was a problem. "Buckle this," I said, quickly and correctly. He tried. His hands were good but not trained. The first knot was wrong. He pulled it tight anyway, hoping tension would make up for ignorance. I tugged once and the knot failed. The leather snapped loose with a little jerk, like a truth coming free. Edric's face went red. He opened his mouth. I didn't let him fill the stable with excuses. "Again," I said. He did it again, slower. His fingers learned as they moved. He tested the tension, pulled twice, adjusted, and tightened until the strap sat the way it should. I tugged again. It held. I didn't praise him. I only nodded. Praise can make a boy proud. A nod makes him hungry for the next correct thing. That was my real test. Not whether he got it right the first time. Almost no one does. The test was whether he could be corrected without turning the correction into a personal insult. Because in battle, the world will correct you. Hard, without politeness. If a boy cannot accept correction in a stable, he will not accept correction when men are dying. Later, I tested him where most young nobles fail. The kitchen. If the stables measure your steadiness, the kitchen measures your character. In the heat and steam, servants moved like a practiced dance. Pots, knives, baskets, wood for the fire. A bowl slipped from an older servant's hands and shattered on stone. Some boys laughed. It's an easy laugh, the laugh of someone who wants to prove he is above mess and labor. Edric did not laugh. He knelt, picked up the broken pieces, and wrapped them in cloth so no one would cut a hand. He didn't look around to see if anyone noticed. He simply did it, because it needed doing. I watched from the doorway without announcing myself. That was another gate, and he walked through it without knowing it. Then I tested him at the real gate. A guard, bored, petty, enjoying his small power, stopped Edric and told him he'd taken the wrong way. The guard pointed him back with a lazy hand, as if turning a dog away from a table. I saw Edric's jaw tighten. I saw the anger rise. A boy's pride is loud even when he doesn't speak. For a moment, I wondered if he would argue, if he would try to win that small battle and lose the larger one. He didn't. He took a breath, he swallowed the anger, he turned around and walked back the way the guard pointed, saying nothing. That was the test I cared about most, because there are times in a Lord's service when you must accept the petty humiliation to protect something bigger. A man who cannot swallow his pride at a gate will draw steel at the wrong moment. He will create an enemy where you needed a silence. When Edric came back through the passage, I stepped out of the shadow. He stopped immediately, eyes lowered, posture controlled. "Good," I said. "You learn to swallow yourself before you try to swallow the road." His eyes flicked up, surprised. Then he nodded. I let the moment hang, just long enough for him to feel its weight. "From today," I told him, "you are a page in my household. You rise before dawn." The gate opened fully then. Not just a gate of wood and iron, but the gate into a life. Edric stepped into the yard, banners above him, mist around his ankles, and the noise of the household moving like a machine, horses breathing, servants calling, boots on stone, iron on leather. He looked small in it, and that was right. A boy must feel small before he learns what it means to carry weight. That night, in a plain dormitory with a lantern burning low, he lay on straw and stared at the beams above, tired in a way that reaches the bone. His hand clenched in the blanket once, then slowly relaxed. And the next morning, before the sun, he stood in the yard with the other boys as the bell called them into the cold. The work began immediately. Buckets, straw, tack, silence in the hall, sweat in the yard. No applause, no heroic music, just repetition. That's how a household forges a knight. Not by telling a boy he is special, but by proving to him, day after day, that only the reliable survive. And when I watched Edric fall into the rhythm, when I saw him stop flinching at correction and start seeking it, I knew the truth I always return to. You don't choose a knight by his name. You choose him by what he does when nobody is cheering. Before dawn, my household always belonged to the bell. You could hear it through stone and fog, a dull iron voice that didn't ask whether you were ready. It simply told you what time it was. And in my world, time is a kind of discipline. The yard would be filled with pale mist rolling in off the sea, banners hanging heavy, and boys stumbling out of sleep in plain wool, their faces still soft with youth and fear. They thought training began when they picked up a sword. It didn't. It began the moment they tried to stand in a straight line with cold in their bones and mud at their feet, and keep their mouths closed when every part of them wanted to complain. Some mornings I started them in the chapel, not because prayer makes a man invincible, but because silence teaches control. A boy who can't kneel in quiet, who can't hold still when nothing is happening, will not hold still when everything is happening. The chapel smelled of wax and damp stone. Candle smoke curled up into the rafters like a slow question. The boys knelt, and their breath made small clouds in the cold. No speeches, just the weight of being present. Then I sent them to the stables. If the chapel taught the mind, the stable taught the truth. The stable doesn't care about family names. It doesn't care about ambition. It only answers to hands and habits. Horses stand there like living towers, warm breath steaming in the dim light, their hooves shifting in straw that hides the filth every boy must learn to clean without flinching. I made them shovel, scrub, carry, brush, and buckle until their shoulders burned and their fingers learned the shape of leather and iron. They learned the smell of sweat and tack oil. They learned to notice a strap beginning to split, a buckle that sat wrong, a girth that wasn't tight enough. I never accepted almost. Almost is how a saddle slips when a man needs it most. In the hall, I taught them a different kind of battle. The hall is where power speaks softly and expects to be obeyed. Boys served wine and bread, stood behind chairs, kept their eyes low, and listened to men discussing land, alliances, and grudges. They learned that one careless glance can insult a noble. One careless word can turn a tense meal into a feud. They learned that a servant's work is not beneath them, because a household stands on what the strong will not do as much as on what the strong can do. Then, when the day warmed and the mud became heavier, I brought them into the yard. That is where the body gets forged. I made them run until their breathing changed. I made them wrestle until they stopped relying on strength and started relying on balance. I made them learn how to fall without breaking their necks, how to stand up without looking for help, how to keep their feet under them when the ground turned slick. A boy wants to look brave. I taught them to look steady. Sword work came after the body, always after. Wooden swords first, because wood is honest. It punishes sloppy movement without killing the learner. I watched their shoulders, their hips, their wrists. I corrected them without shouting, because shouting teaches boys to look for emotion, not accuracy. I wanted them watching angles and timing, not my temper. I taught them to strike and return, to keep a guard that didn't collapse, to stop the blade where it should stop, because a strike that cannot stop becomes a mistake in armor. I taught them shield work the same way, not as decoration, but as survival. Lift it to cover the throat and jaw, because pride makes young men show their faces, and the world will take what is offered. And then I brought them to the quintain. That wooden target on a pivot looks harmless from a distance. It isn't. It is a lesson with no pity. Tom/Edric ran at it the first time with all the confidence of a boy who wants to prove himself. He hit the center cleanly. He even smiled as if the story would end there. But the quintain arm swung back with the same certainty the world swings back at arrogance. It clipped his shoulder and nearly took him out of the saddle. He hit the mud hard enough to knock the air out of his soul. The other boys laughed, because laughter is what boys do when they're relieved it wasn't them. Tom spat mud and looked at me with anger in his eyes. "I hit it," he protested. "I did what you said." And I gave him the answer that keeps men alive longer than talent does. Hitting isn't enough, I told him. If you hit and don't escape, you've only managed to die with good aim. That's what I was teaching in every corner of my household, the difference between doing a thing and surviving the consequence of doing it. I told him to stand up. He wanted to argue again. He didn't, really. He was learning. He was learning to swallow the first hot response and do the work again. He mounted again, slower and more careful. On the second run, he struck cleanly and leaned away at the right moment. The swinging arm passed behind him, close enough to remind him what it wanted, far enough to let him live. I didn't clap. I didn't praise. I nodded once. A nod is enough when a boy understands what he's earned. When the sun dropped and the yard emptied, the work didn't end. The work simply moved indoors. In the armory and the workroom, under lamplight and smoke, the boys repaired what the day had damaged. They stitched straps. They oiled belts. They wiped grime from mail rings. They tightened buckles and checked knots. Most people never see that part. They only see the charge, the clash, the banners. They don't see the needle passing through leather again and again until the fingers ache. They don't see the boy who learns to keep working when his friends are asleep, because a strap that breaks tomorrow might break a man. One night I walked through the workroom and saw Tom bent over a strap, shoulders rounded with fatigue, hands still careful. He didn't notice me at first. That pleased me. He wasn't performing for approval. He was simply doing what needed doing. The lamplight made the smoke climb the walls in strange shapes. For a moment, only a moment, it looked like the shadow of a giant smith standing behind me, a figure built from ember and cold dark haze, hammer raised, patient and indifferent. Then the smoke shifted, and it was only smoke again. I didn't tell Tom what I saw. I didn't need to. The truth of the image was already living in the room. This is a forge, not of steel, but of habits, of nerve, of restraint, of reliability. Tom looked up finally, eyes tired, waiting for a verdict I rarely gave in words. I didn't offer him softness. I offered him something better, acknowledgement without spoiling. I placed my hand on his shoulder for the length of a heartbeat, just long enough for him to feel that I had seen the work. Then I walked on. He returned to the strap. That mattered more than any thank you. That is how the household works when it is built properly. Chapel, stable, hall, yard, workroom, over and over until the boy stops thinking of discipline as punishment and starts thinking of it as identity. Because on the day the world finally comes for him, on the day fog closes in, and steel moves in the white, and the man beside him falls, he will not rise to the level of his dreams. He will fall to the level of his training. And if I've done my job, that level will be high enough to hold the line. When boys grow into squires, they stop dreaming in whispers. They begin to ask for things out loud. It happened on the road, on a wet track bordered by hedges and bare branches, with the sky pressed low and gray above us. The column moved at a steady pace, horses picking their way through mud, men keeping their spacing, banners damp and heavy in the wind. That kind of march has its own music. Leather creaking, mail shifting, hoofbeats softened by wet earth. Not a song for glory, a rhythm for work. Tom rode close to me, as he had learned to do, spare reins over his shoulder, a small shield strapped where he could reach it. He had grown taller, his hands were tougher, and the hunger in him had sharpened into a question he could no longer keep inside. "My lord," he said, careful but eager, "if I do well, will you make me a knight?" There it was, the bright temptation, the simple bargain his young mind wanted, action for reward, blood for honor, a straight path. I looked ahead at the road, not at him, because sometimes the answer is easier to hear when you don't watch a boy's face react. "I don't make a knight because he earns a moment," I said. "I make him a knight because he becomes someone I can trust." Trust is not a single deed. Trust is a habit. A boy can ride bravely once. A boy can swing hard once. Luck can carry a man through one good day. But war does not ask for one good day. It asks for the same steadiness on the 100th day, when you are cold and tired and angry and afraid. Tom fell quiet. He didn't argue. That, at least, meant my words landed where they needed to. Later, in camp, the air was thick with smoke from damp fires and the smell of men living too close together. Some of the young knights were restless, their eyes bright, the way eyes get bright before a fight, as if battle were a festival and not a cost. I gathered them and spoke plainly. "You want to be remembered. Fine. But remember this. Your fame will be what other men say. Your consequences will be what you carry. It is easy to promise bravery when the sun is still up. It is harder to hold yourself when the world turns ugly." That lesson came soon enough. We found ourselves in a small clash, nothing that minstrels would sing about, just the kind of hard, muddy violence that happens when men with grudges meet on the wrong road. Fog hung low, grass turned slick, shields knocked and scraped, spear points darted like teeth. Horses shied and stamped. Voices rose and broke. It wasn't a clean duel. It was confusion, and confusion always invites the worst version of a young man. In the churn of it, an enemy went down. He dropped his weapon and fell to his knees in the mud, hands raised, not like a trick, but like a man who understood he had reached the end of his strength. His eyes were wide with fear. His breath came in short bursts, visible in the cold air. A young knight on our side saw the kneeling man and did what anger always tries to make a young knight do. He rushed in to finish it. I saw the blade lifting. I saw the intent behind it. I saw how quickly a victory can turn into a crime. "Stop!" I shouted. My voice cut through the noise the way steel cuts through cloth. The young knight checked himself mid-stride, boots skidding slightly in the mud. His arms kept moving for a heartbeat because momentum doesn't care about pride, and then his arms caught up and forced the blade down. That moment when a sword is already in motion and a man must still choose to stop is where a knight is truly tested. He glared at me. His chest heaved. Rage and adrenaline turned his face red beneath the edge of his helmet. "But he's the enemy," he said, as if that settled everything. I stepped close and tapped my own chest with 2 fingers. "The enemy out there is easy. The enemy in here will ruin you, and it will ruin whoever stands beside you. A man who cannot control his anger is not a weapon. He is a falling blade. He cuts whoever is nearest, including the hand that holds him." The kneeling enemy stayed still, trembling. The young knight's sword lowered. The moment passed. And in that passing, a line was drawn, not on the ground, but inside the men watching. Tom was among them. I saw his face, and I knew he understood. Not just with his mind, with the part of him that would remember this when his own blood ran hot. Later that night, under the canvas of my tent with a lantern burning low and rain tapping the fabric like impatient fingers, Tom came to me with a question he didn't want answered. "If I can't hold myself, what happens? Would you send me away?" I looked at him until he stopped squirming and stood still. "Yes," I said. I didn't soften it. A softened rule becomes a suggestion, and suggestions get men killed. Tom went pale. He swallowed. Then he waited, the way a boy waits for a blow. I didn't strike him. I didn't need to. "I can't place I couldn't help it beside the men who rely on me," I told him. "If you want to be a knight, you must first become a man who can hold his own hand." That is the hardest discipline, harder than any drill, harder than learning to ride with a lance, harder than learning to take a hit and stand again. Because holding your hand means holding your pride, holding your anger, holding your need to be seen. It means accepting that sometimes the bravest thing you do is not the strike you land, but the strike you refuse. Tom nodded. No protest, no sulk, just the heavy acceptance of medicine. When he left the tent, the night air was cold and wet. He sat by a small fire and stared at his hands as if he were meeting them for the first time. He flexed his fingers, then let them rest. The smoke curled upward and broke apart in the wind, and I thought, as I have thought many times, that men spend their lives learning a simple truth too late. A sword is not the hardest thing to control. A man is. The next morning, Tom moved differently. Still tired, still young, but steadier. He checked buckles twice. He tightened straps carefully. He spoke less. He looked more. He stayed close without crowding. He did the work that keeps a line from breaking. That's what I needed him to learn. Because war is not only about winning. It is about not becoming something you can't live with after you've won. And if you want to know what separates a boy who earns a title from a boy who earns a grave, it is often nothing more than this. When the moment comes, can he stop his own hand?
Under King John. The air of England tasted different. Not just because the weather was often wet and bitter, but because trust itself had gone sour. You could feel it in the way men held their cups a little tighter in the hall. The way messengers hesitated at doorways. The way every seal of wax looked less like an assurance and more like a question. Will this still matter tomorrow? We met in stone rooms built for certainty, thick walls, heavy beams, narrow windows, yet nothing outside those walls was certain anymore. Rain hammered the shutters. Smoke from the hearth crawled along the rafters. On the long table, maps and letters lay open like wounds. Men pointed at roads and towns as if a finger could pin chaos in place. Some wanted the simple answer: violence. One knight struck his fist on the table and demanded we ride out and break our enemies by force alone. The cups trembled, wine spilled and crept across the wood, dark as a spreading stain. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I set my hand on the table, flat, steady, and the room quieted. Not because they loved me, but because they understood the weight behind a calm man's restraint. Your sword is not a stick for your anger, I told them. If you strike blindly, you won't strike the enemy. You'll strike your own land. That was the heart of it in John's reign. The enemy was not only outside our borders. The enemy was inside our habits, pride, impatience, the hunger to be seen as strong even when strength would ruin us. And so my work changed. When a realm is stable, you train men to fight. When a realm is cracking, you train men to hold. I trained them in the rain until they stopped thinking of retreat as shame. Young knights love the idea of never stepping back. They think courage means forward. Always forward. That is a child's idea of bravery. I taught them the adult version. Retreat is not cowardice, I said. Retreat in panic is cowardice. So we practiced it. Shield walls stepping backward in order. Shields overlapping like planks on a ship. Spears angled. Spacing kept. We practiced pulling a wounded man behind the line without tearing the formation open. We practiced moving like one body. Because one man's pride can get a dozen men killed. In the yard, you could see the truth immediately. A man who scoffed at the drill would be the first to scatter when arrows fell. A man who learned to step back without breaking the line would save lives when the world demanded it. But training in John's time was not only steel and mud. It was ink and wax. I began to teach Tom, my squire then, something many knights never bother to learn, that a letter can kill faster than a blade if it is mishandled. I showed him seals, not just how to recognize them, but how to respect what they meant. I made him watch the messengers who delivered them. A man's eyes, his breath, the mud on his boots, those things can tell you as much as the parchment in his hand. And I taught Tom a rule that sounds simple but saves men from their own vanity. Deliver words the way you deliver a weapon. I told him, steady hands, no tremble, no extra flourish, and no extra words. Young men love to add words. They think speech makes them important. But in a fragile realm, speech can be poison. So I made him practice. Walk, stop, bow, present the seal outward, speak only what must be spoken. Then silence. Let the Lord read. Let the room decide. A messenger who cannot control his mouth is as dangerous as a knight who cannot control his sword. In council, while men argued and plans changed with every new report, Tom learned to stand still. He learned to keep his face calm even when the news was bad. He learned to breathe slowly in a room where panic wanted to climb everyone's throat. That discipline mattered more than most men understand, because the leaders around us were not always disciplined. Under John, the realm often felt like a cart with a loose wheel. It could keep moving, but every turn threatened to throw it into a ditch. Then John died, and we were left with something even more fragile than a kingdom at war, an idea of a kingdom carried by a child. Henry was young, too young to bear what was placed on his head. And in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity, this was no longer about my name, my lands, or my pride. This was about keeping England from tearing itself apart long enough for a boy to grow into a king. That is why I demanded restraint when others demanded fury. That is why I tightened standards when others wanted shortcuts. That is why I looked at every young knight and asked myself a colder question than, is he brave? I asked, will he hold when the realm shakes? One night, after a long council, I slept in a chamber where the candle burned low and the storm would not end. I dreamed a strange dream, simple in shape, heavy in meaning. In the dream, England was a wooden ship on a black sea. Not a fine ship, not a proud ship, just a ship trying not to break. The waves slammed the hull, the wind howled, and the timbers groaned under pressure. And I saw that the nails holding the ship together were men. A single nail loosens, and water finds the gap. Another loosens, and the gap grows. Soon, the ship isn't defeated by an enemy fleet, it's defeated by the slow, stupid failure of its own fastenings. I woke with the taste of salt in my mouth as if I had truly been at sea. I don't claim that dream was prophecy, but it was honest. It told me what I already knew and could not ignore. In a crisis, the smallest weaknesses become disasters. So I went back to work. Back to councils where I had to calm proud men without humiliating them. Back to drills where I had to teach young knights that saving lives sometimes looks like stepping back, not charging forward. Back to letters and seals and messengers. Because the kingdom was being fought not only in fields, but in promises, promises that had to be carried, guarded, and kept. And when we finally moved again, through wet roads and anxious villages, with banners lifting in a new wind, I watched Tom ride behind me with a steadier posture than before. He carried letters as carefully as he carried steel. He spoke less. He listened more. He had begun to understand the truth that John's reign taught better than any tournament ever could. A kingdom is not held together by glory. It is held together by discipline, quiet, unromantic, relentless, strong enough to keep men from breaking their own ship in the storm. Lincoln began as a colorless world. Just white fog, cold air, and the faint outline of a city that looked more like a rumor than a place. The walls and the great church beyond them were shadows floating in the mist. Men spoke in half voices. Horses breathed steam. Mail was dull and wet. Banners hung heavy, as if even cloth didn't want to move. This is what people rarely understand about battle. It doesn't always start with noise. Sometimes it starts with silence so thick you can taste it. I sat my horse in that silence and looked down the line. Not to admire it, there was nothing to admire yet, but to feel whether it would hold. A line is not made of steel. It is made of trust. And trust is made long before the morning of a battle. In stables and courtyards and cold drills when nobody is cheering. Tom stood close beside me. He was older now, almost grown, but in that fog he looked like every boy I had ever trained, caught between fear and pride, trying to pretend one could cancel the other. He held spare reins and a shield strap, hands tight but controlled. His breath came in pale clouds. He leaned toward me and spoke the truth most men hide. My lord, I'm afraid. I didn't mock him. I didn't soothe him with a lie. I gave him the only answer that keeps a young man honest. Good, I said. He looked up, startled. If you feel nothing, I told him, you're either foolish or you haven't understood what you can lose. Fear isn't shame, running is. He swallowed. He nodded. The fear didn't vanish. Fear rarely vanishes, but it changed shape. It became something he could hold instead of something that held him. Then the signal came. A horn, a movement of banners, a ripple down the line. The fog filled with motion. Boots sank into wet earth. Hooves punched holes in mud. Men tightened straps. Lances lowered by degrees, not all at once, like a door closing slowly. When the first clash hit, it was not clean, it was crushing. Shields slammed, spear points searched for gaps, horses shoved and sidestepped. The fog became a grey churn. thick with breath and dust and the sound of wood protesting under impact. In that chaos, the mistake young men want to make is simple: they chase their own courage like it's a prize. They break formation, they run forward to become a story. I did not need stories. I needed a line that stayed unbroken. That's why my signals were small. A hand here, a tilt of the head there, a shift in spacing. Men who have been trained properly don't require speeches in the moment. They require a clear gesture. And then they move. I chose a gap, not a man. I aimed for the seam in the enemy's order, where pressure would turn their confidence into confusion. Not the loudest target, the strongest structure. And behind me, Tom did what I had told him to do in Newark, long before this day had a name. He stayed close. He did not surge forward. He did not try to be heroic. Then a rider to our side was yanked from his horse. It happened fast. One moment he was above the press. The next he was on the ground. A body in armor falls like a stone. The weight drags you down. The mud doesn't care what you intended. I saw the line wobble. That's how it begins. A small wobble becomes a hole. A hole becomes panic. Panic becomes death. Tom saw it too. I watched him for a heartbeat. The heartbeat where a boy decides whether he will obey his training or obey his blood. He moved. Not wildly, not like a fool with a dream, like a man with a job. He ran low through the chaos, careful with his footing, and he and another man dragged the fallen rider backward, out of the crush. Tom didn't lift with his arms alone, he used his legs. His hips, the way you're taught when you want to lift something heavy without breaking yourself. He kept the movement short and controlled. He didn't make a spectacle. He made a rescue. Then he brought forward the spare horse at the right moment, guiding it with calm hands. A frightened horse will kill you by accident if you tug and panic. Tom didn't panic. He fed the animal steadiness until the animal returned it. That was the moment I knew, truly knew, that the boy had crossed the line I always watch for. He had learned the difference between doing something brave and doing something correct. A brief glance was all I gave him. A commander can't afford long acknowledgments in battle. But Tom saw it. He saw that I had noticed. And he returned immediately to the work, as if the work itself was enough. That is the mark of someone worth trusting. As the fighting pushed toward Lincoln's streets, the fog began to thin. Trapped between stone and timber, the battle became a series of narrow passages, cobbles slick with rain and blood. Shoulders pressed close, shields scraping walls. Men slipped and recovered, stumbled and rose. There is no room for heroic posing in a street. There is only room for balance. I kept my men moving. I kept them from scattering. I kept them from turning victory into cruelty. Because I knew that in a civil war, every excess becomes a new enemy. And then, slowly, the weight shifted. The enemy began to give ground. Our banners rose higher in the mist. The sound of fighting changed. Not louder, but different, less frantic, more certain. When the last hard moments eased and the city began to breathe again. The streets were filled with the cost, broken shields, shattered spear shafts, men sitting in the mud staring at their hands as if they didn't recognize them. Tom sat like that, too, boots dark with mud and blood, hands trembling in a way he couldn't control. He looked up at me as if he needed permission to believe he had survived. Did I do it? He asked. I knelt beside him, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is meet a man at his level. My mail settled with a familiar weight, and the noise around us faded for a moment. You did the right work, I said, that's all. His shoulders sagged with relief, not because I praised him, but because I named what mattered. People will tell stories about me and Lincoln. They'll tell stories about an old man who still rode into battle. They'll make it sound like a single charge saved a kingdom. That's not how kingdoms are saved. Kingdoms are saved when the line doesn't break, when a squire drags a fallen rider out of the crush instead of chasing glory. When men follow small signals. When discipline, drilled in mud and silence, shows up in fog and steel. As the day waned, smoke rose in thin columns from damaged places, and sunlight began to color the city in a warmer tone. For a heartbeat, the smoke on the wall looked like a giant smith standing there, faceless. Patient, hammer raised in the sky. Then the wind shifted and it was only smoke again. But the meaning remained. Lincoln was not just a battle. It was a test of a lifetime of forging, not only of me, but of the young men who had learned under my hand. And that day, in the fog, they held, the last room of a warrior is never as loud as people imagine. They expect trumpets, prayers shouted over a crowd, a final speech that lands neatly like a banner planted in earth. But the truth is quieter, a winter light through narrow windows, a hearth burning low, smoke that climbs the rafters in slow, patient curls, the soft scrape of a servant's shoe on stone, the small, careful sounds of a household trying not to disturb the moment. I lay there, and I could feel how the world narrows when a life is almost done. Not because the world becomes smaller, but because everything unnecessary finally falls away. Near the bed, my sword rested where it always should, within reach. But not in my hand. The leather grip was worn smooth by years. The blade held no magic, only the evidence of work, tiny scratches, dull shine, the kind of honest wear that comes from being carried through mud and rain and decision. It looked less like a weapon now and more like a period at the end of a long sentence. Edric stood beside me. He wasn't a boy anymore. Not the page who crossed my gate with fear hidden behind his teeth. Not the squire who fell in mud and learned to rise without complaint. He was a man, and there was a different kind of stillness in him now. The stillness of someone who has seen what steel does and no longer needs to pretend it is beautiful. He bowed his head, hands clasped, trying to keep his breathing even. I could see the effort in it. Discipline doesn't make grief disappear. It simply keeps grief from driving the horse. He waited, as if the room itself required permission to speak. Then he asked me the question that matters more than any title. "My lord," he said, and his voice was steady enough to be trusted, "if I'm ever the one who must train men, where do I begin?" It was the right question. Not, how do I win? Not, how do I look great? But, how do I make others reliable? I turned my eyes toward the hearth, toward the smoke, toward the sword, toward the boy who wasn't a boy. A lifetime of images came to me in fragments. A child at a gate, too small for the danger around him. A stable in Normandy, warm with horse breath. A tournament field, dust in the mouth. Council tables, wax seals, arguments that could tear a realm. Fog at Lincoln, where everything you teach is tested in one breath. When I spoke, I didn't dress the answer in poetry. A man dying doesn't have time for ornament. You begin, I told him, by choosing the kind of man who holds his word when there's no witness. In my experience, that is rarer than courage. Many men are brave when a crowd watches. Far fewer are honest when it would be easy to take a shortcut. A knight who lies in small matters will lie in large ones. And large lies don't stay inside one man's mouth. They spread through a household like rot. Edric nodded once, almost imperceptibly. He was not collecting phrases. He was collecting rules to live by. And you choose the kind of man who can stay calm when everything around him breaks. I continued, because everything breaks. Plans break, lines break, kings die, friends fall. If a man's mind breaks with it, he becomes another problem you must carry. I watched Edric's jaw tighten, not in anger, but in recognition. He had seen it himself, how panic can turn strong men into a stampede. You choose the kind of man who can hold formation, I said, even when his blood tells him to run ahead. A formation is more than a military shape. It is an agreement. It is trust made visible. It is the difference between a group of armed men and a force that can protect something. The moment a young knight breaks formation to chase his own glory, he tears a hole not only in the line, but in the safety of everyone beside him. Edric's eyes flicked briefly, as if seeing Lincoln again, as if hearing the wet sound of boots on cobbles and the scrape of shields against stone. He had been there, he had held the line not with loud heroics, but with the correct work. Then I took a breath that felt deeper than the others, and I said the last thing, perhaps the hardest thing, for a warrior to accept. You choose the kind of man who keeps mercy when he has the right to be cruel. Mercy is not weakness, it is control, it is a leash on violence. And without that leash, the very idea of knighthood becomes a lie. A man who cannot stop himself from cruelty will turn any victory into a new enemy. He will make peace impossible. He will stain your name and call it strength. Edric looked down, his eyes shone, but he did not let tears become a performance. He simply absorbed it, the way you absorb a wound you can't refuse. I will remember, he said. I believed him, not because he said it, but because I could hear the weight in his voice. A young man promises quickly. A grown man promises slowly. The hearth snapped softly, a coal settled, smoke thickened for a moment, then drifted toward the rafters like a slow tide. And for a heartbeat, just a heartbeat, the smoke gathered into a shape that my mind had carried for years, a faceless smith. Towering, patient, hammer raised, not a god, not a monster, just the image of what a life of discipline feels like when you try to understand it all at once. Then the shape broke apart, as smoke always does, and the room returned to what it truly was: stone, fire, breath, and the quiet presence of the man who would carry my household forward. I did not tell Edric what I saw. I didn't need to. The meaning was already between us. Because the truth is this: my work was never only on battlefields. My work was in mornings when boys wanted to sleep, in stables when they wanted to boast, in halls when they wanted to speak, in moments when they wanted to strike, and I taught him to stop their hands. A great lord can leave land. He can leave gold. He can leave a name. But the only inheritance that truly holds is a standard, a way of choosing and shaping men so that the world does not collapse the moment you are gone. My breathing grew quieter. The room felt warmer and farther away at the same time. Edric stayed until the end, not saying more than he needed to say, not touching what didn't need to be touched. That was also part of the lesson, knowing when restraint is respect. Outside, the household would wake before dawn as it always did. Boys would move through mist. Horses would breathe into cold air. Leather would be buckled and tested. A strap would be stitched. A cup would be carried without spilling. The same small things, repeated, until small things became strength. That is how a forge stays lit. Not with spectacle. With discipline that outlives the man who lit it in the first place.